Sophia Carter had always known what it felt like to be sidelined by her own family. At 34 years old, in the winter of 2017, while her older brother, Lucas, thrived at the city's most prestigious real estate firm, she was buried in old archives inside a cramped office, surrounded by dusty bookshelves and yellowed folders. Since childhood, Sophia had carried the weight of never being enough in her parents' eyes, especially after choosing a profession they saw as having no future. While Lucas was celebrated with lavish parties for his achievements, Sophia quietly rejoiced in every historical discovery she made, with no one even noticing her efforts. On that cold June day, Sophia arrived early at the office, wrapped in her favorite coat and holding a steaming cup of coffee, feeling that familiar mix of tranquility and solitude that had long become part of her routine. Seated at her worn wooden desk, she flipped through documents dating back to the early 20th century when, suddenly, something caught her eye. The name Monteverdi appeared prominently in an old contract, accompanied by an illegible signature and an odd clause, nearly forgotten by time. A strange chill ran down her spine as she realized that this small, fragile piece of paper could change everything, not just for her brother's real estate firm, but for the very balance of power within her family. Sophia felt her heartbeat accelerate as she carefully unfolded the brittle, yellowed document. Her eyes scanned each handwritten line, noticing the faded ink and the paper's fragile texture beneath her fingers. It was a deed dated precisely April 12, 1923, detailing the ownership transfer of the historic Monteverdi building to the city's Heritage Foundation, a fact mysteriously omitted from every modern registry Lucas had consulted. Her pulse quickened. For years, she had quietly tolerated Lucas's arrogant boasts and her parents' subtle jabs, but this discovery gave her a chance she never dreamed of. A chance not only to stand up for herself, but also to finally reveal her true worth to a family blinded by vanity. Sophia spent the next several days diving deeper into the archives, meticulously cross-referencing each handwritten entry, determined to verify every detail before making any move. She skipped meals, ignored incoming calls, and focused solely on unraveling the truth behind that hidden document. Her boss, Mr. Everett, a gentle elderly historian who appreciated her dedication, occasionally peeked into her cluttered office, observing silently with an understanding nod. He knew Sophia was onto something significant, though he never pressed for details. As the family dinner, set for Friday evening, drew closer, Sophia finally felt prepared. She held undeniable proof that could halt Lucas's multi-million-dollar deal overnight, exposing a century-old secret buried beneath layers of greed, oversight, and negligence. When Friday evening finally arrived, Sophia parked her modest car in front of the Carter family mansion, feeling an uneasy tension rising in her chest. The grand house loomed over her, its white pillars illuminated under the warm glow of lanterns, a stark reminder of the opulence she had chosen to walk away from. She clutched a small leather bag tightly, inside it a folder containing the documents she had meticulously prepared, her secret weapon carefully concealed. Taking a deep breath, Sophia approached the front door, bracing herself for the usual cold reception from her family. Before she could knock, the heavy oak door swung open abruptly, revealing Lucas standing there with his usual confident smirk, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit. "Well, if it isn't our family's archivist," Lucas sneered, stepping aside mockingly to let her in. Sophia silently walked past him, the quiet click of her heels echoing sharply against the polished marble floors. Inside, the luxurious living room was buzzing with chatter and clinking glasses. Relatives mingled effortlessly, exchanging stories of recent successes. Her parents stood near the grand piano, entertaining guests with tales of Lucas's latest triumphs. Their eyes briefly met Sophia's as she entered, but quickly diverted in subtle disapproval. Fighting back familiar disappointment, Sophia took her place quietly at the far end of the long dining table, clutching a leather-bound folder tightly to her chest, knowing that tonight, for once, the narrative would change. Dinner commenced with the usual rituals of polished silverware clinking against fine porcelain and superficial conversations about property acquisitions and charity galas. Sophia listened quietly, barely tasting the lavish meal placed before her, her mind spinning with nervous anticipation. Across the table, Lucas dominated the conversation, animatedly describing his vision for the Monteverdi building, his voice echoing confidently through the chandelier-lit dining room. Each word felt like a sharpened needle, piercing Sophia's patience. She could feel her pulse throbbing in her temples, anxiety mixing with determination as she prepared herself to speak up. The moment she had meticulously planned for days was rapidly approaching, and Sophia knew there was no turning back. Just as Lucas stood, raising a crystal glass filled with expensive champagne to propose a toast celebrating his impending deal, Sophia cleared her throat audibly, breaking the smooth flow of his speech. The room fell abruptly. Silent, all eyes now fixed on her, a mixture of annoyance and curiosity spreading across their faces. "I'm sorry to interrupt your celebration, Lucas," she began quietly, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air, "but I found something you all need to see." With hands that trembled ever so slightly, she opened the leather-bound folder and slid copies of the old deed across the table. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room as her parents exchanged confused glances, while Lucas snatched up the document, his expression shifting quickly from confusion to disbelief as his eyes darted furiously over the faded handwriting. Lucas's face turned pale as he read the document, his arrogant smirk dissolving into disbelief. "This can't be real," he murmured, eyes scanning frantically over each line, desperation evident in his trembling fingers. Sophia watched quietly, sensing her brother's confidence crumble in real time. The room filled with tense whispers as family members passed the copies around, each one reacting with shock or skepticism. Sophia's parents, usually unflappable, stared at her speechless, finally confronted by the quiet daughter they'd always underestimated. For the first time, Sophia felt seen, her heartbeat a mix of relief and an unexpected pang of sadness. It took exposing a century-old lie for her family to finally acknowledge her worth. "What exactly is your point with this, Sophia?" Lucas snapped suddenly, regaining a shred of composure, though anger simmered visibly beneath his controlled facade. Sophia straightened her posture, looking calmly into her brother's eyes. "My point is simple, Lucas. You can't legally buy the Monteverdi building. The property was deeded to the city's Heritage Foundation decades ago, and nobody realized, or bothered to verify, the paperwork properly." Lucas slammed his hand hard against the polished mahogany table, causing everyone at the table to jump slightly. "You planned this, didn't you?" he accused bitterly, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Sophia held her ground, meeting his accusation with steady eyes. "No, Lucas. I just did my job, thoroughly and honestly. Something our family seems to have forgotten how to do." The silence following Sophia's words settled over the room like a heavy fog, choking the breath out of every guest seated around the table. The once cheerful dining room now felt unbearably small, pressing everyone into an uncomfortable and suffocating closeness. Her parents exchanged a tense glance, visibly struggling to process the unsettling reality revealed by the daughter they'd overlooked for years. Sophia felt a tight knot forming in her throat, not out of fear, but from the emotional weight of finally voicing her truth to those who had caused her so much pain. Meanwhile, Lucas, enraged and visibly shaken, clenched his fists tightly against the polished surface of the table, eyes blazing as he stared helplessly at the documents, unable to dispute their undeniable validity. Before Lucas could react further, their father, Jonathan Carter, always imposing and authoritative, slowly stood up. His face, usually marked by a cold, superior expression, now looked surprisingly defeated and vulnerable. "Sophia," he began, his voice unexpectedly soft, "do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation?" Although spoken quietly, his words carried a profound sense of disappointment. Sophia held her father's gaze, feeling a sharp pang in her chest, but she refused to back down. "I understand perfectly, Dad," she replied calmly, her voice clear and steady. "But do you? Did you ever try to understand how I felt, constantly being treated like I didn't matter in this family?" Her words resonated deeply, leaving Jonathan momentarily speechless, as her mother silently looked away, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. A heavy silence enveloped the dining room, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock by the doorway. Sophia's words lingered in the air, exposing years of unspoken resentment. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, frustration evident as he rubbed his temples, struggling to accept that his grand vision was unraveling before his eyes. He had always relied on charm, status, and family influence to close deals, But this confrontation was something entirely new, raw and painfully personal. Sophia could see the turmoil clearly etched on her brother's face, and while part of her felt a brief pang of guilt for disrupting their family dynamic, another, stronger part swelled with pride for finally standing her ground. Jonathan Carter cleared his throat, visibly struggling to regain control of the situation. Sophia, was this really necessary? Did you have to expose our family in this way? His voice now carried a mix of irritation and discomfort, his eyes scanning the faces around the table, searching for support. Sophia took a slow breath, keeping her composure, despite the years of suppressed frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Dad, this isn't about ruining our reputation. It's about honesty. Lucas was about to invest millions into something he legally can't even buy. Do you really think I should have stayed silent and let it happen? She watched as Jonathan's jaw tensed, his mind racing to find a response that would preserve his authority without admitting that, for once, Sophia was absolutely right. Lucas exhaled sharply, his frustration boiling over as he threw the document onto the table. So what now, Sophia? You get to stand here and play the hero while I watch everything I've worked for fall apart? His voice dripped with bitterness, his ego too bruised to see past his anger. The room remained silent, the weight of his words hanging between them. Sophia didn't flinch. She had anticipated this reaction. Lucas had never been the type to handle setbacks with grace. I didn't do this to sabotage you, she said firmly, keeping her tone steady. I did this because it's the truth. If you had done your due diligence, you would have seen this coming. You were so focused on making the biggest deal of your career that you ignored the details that actually matter. Lucas scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. And what do you suggest I do, then? Just walk away and let my reputation burn? His voice cracked slightly, betraying the anxiety creeping in beneath his anger. Sophia sighed, her grip on the chair tightening as she debated whether to extend the olive branch she had been considering. I can help you, she said finally. If you're willing to swallow your pride, I can make sure this doesn't destroy you. There are legal ways to restructure this deal, alternative properties you can invest in that won't leave you tangled in lawsuits. For the first time that evening, Lucas hesitated. His arrogance had carried him this far, but even he wasn't foolish enough to ignore the reality of the situation. His gaze flickered to their father, seeking guidance, but Jonathan remained silent, his expression unreadable. The choice was Lucas's alone. Lucas clenched his jaw, his pride warring against the undeniable truth in Sophia's words. The thought of accepting her help, of admitting that she had outmaneuvered him, was almost unbearable. But as he glanced around the room, seeing the uneasy expressions of their parents and the curious, judgmental stares of the extended family, he knew he had no other option. If he walked away now, his reputation wouldn't just take a hit, it would shatter completely. Slowly, he exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. Fine, he muttered, his voice tight with resentment. What's your plan? Sophia remained calm, though she felt the tiniest flicker of satisfaction at her brother's reluctant surrender. First, you need to back out of the Monteverde deal publicly before the media turns this into something worse, she explained. Blame it on unforeseen legal complications, not incompetence. Then, we start looking into properties with similar potential but without this kind of historical baggage. Lucas scoffed, crossing his arms. And I suppose you already have a list of those, don't you? Sophia met his gaze, unshaken. I do. And if you actually listen to me this time, you might end up making a smarter deal than the one you almost signed. Jonathan, who had remained silent throughout their exchange, finally spoke. If Sophia can fix this, let her. His voice carried a finality that left no room for argument. Lucas, still seething, had no choice but to agree. The tension in the room finally began to ease, though the weight of the confrontation still lingered in the air. Lucas, clearly displeased but seeing no other way out, reached for his glass of champagne and took a slow sip, as if trying to wash down his own pride. Sophia, on the other hand, felt something shift within her. For years, she had been the overlooked, harder, dismissed and belittled, but tonight, for the first time, she was not just being heard, she was being respected. Even if Lucas refused to admit it outright, he knew he needed her. And Jonathan's reluctant endorsement was as close to validation as she would ever get from him. Their mother, Eleanor, who had remained eerily quiet throughout the entire ordeal, finally broke her silence. "Sophia," she said softly, her delicate fingers tracing the rim of her untouched wine glass, "why didn't you ever tell us about your work before?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, just curious. Sophia blinked, surprised by the question. She could have laughed. "Would you have listened?" she asked simply. Eleanor opened her mouth as if to respond but quickly closed it again, realizing the answer was already obvious. The truth was, they had never cared to ask. Sophia had built an entire career, a reputation, and a company right under their noses, yet they had been too preoccupied with Lucas's successes to even notice. The realization settled over the table like an uncomfortable shadow. Eleanor lowered her gaze, suddenly fascinated by the deep red swirl of her wine. The weight of Sophia's words had landed, and for once, there was no convenient excuse, no deflection to hide behind. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken regret. Lucas, still visibly tense, drummed his fingers against the table, clearly desperate to move past the uncomfortable moment. "So," he said, forcing a casual tone, "what's the next step?" It was an attempt to regain control, to shift the focus away from the reality that had just been laid bare. Sophia allowed herself a small smirk, typical Lucas, always trying to steer the narrative. But this time, she was the one holding the reins. "I'll draft a formal withdrawal notice for the Monteverdi deal first thing in the morning," she said smoothly. "After that, we'll go over the alternative properties I've been tracking." She met Lucas's gaze, daring him to challenge her authority on this. To her surprise, he didn't. He simply nodded, jaw still tight, but his resistance was faltering. Their father, still watching everything unfold with a contemplative look, finally leaned back in his chair. "If this works," Jonathan said, his voice measured, "perhaps we should consider bringing you on as a consultant for Carter and Associates." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was an acknowledgement. A reluctant admission that, for all these years, they had underestimated her. Sophia met his eyes and, for the first time, saw something other than disappointment. She saw recognition. A flicker of something unfamiliar crossed Sophia's chest, not quite triumph, but something close. She had spent years believing this moment would never come, that her family would always see her as the odd one out, the disappointment. And yet, here they were, not just acknowledging her work but inviting her into the very business they once deemed too prestigious for her. But she wasn't foolish. She knew this wasn't an act of sudden affection, it was necessity. They needed her expertise, and for the first time, she had something they couldn't afford to ignore. "I'll consider it," she replied carefully, her tone neutral. She wasn't about to jump at their offer like some neglected child desperate for approval. If she was going to be part of Carter and Associates, it would be on her terms. Lucas exhaled sharply, as if the mere idea of Sophia having leverage over him was physically painful. But he said nothing. Their father gave a slow nod, seemingly accepting her answer. Eleanor, still visibly shaken by the night's revelations, gave Sophia a look that almost resembled admiration, though it was laced with guilt. "We should talk more," she murmured, almost to herself. Sophia simply nodded, unwilling to let sentimentality cloud what had just happened. The evening had shifted in a way none of them had expected. As she sat there, watching her family digest the new reality, Sophia realized something important. She no longer needed their validation. Whether they accepted her or not no longer mattered. Because for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the power. The dinner eventually resumed, though the atmosphere had undeniably changed. Conversations were more subdued, the usual arrogance in Lucas's tone noticeably absent. Sophia, for once, didn't feel like an outsider at her own family's table. She wasn't sure if that was because they had changed or because she had. Either way, it didn't matter. The truth had been spoken, and there was no going back. As the evening wound down, Sophia gathered her things, tucking the leather folder back into her bag. Lucas remained seated, staring at his untouched dessert, lost in thought. Jonathan, ever the stoic patriarch, simply nodded at her as she passed, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. Eleanor, however, hesitated. "Sophia," she called softly. As her daughter reached the door, Sophia turned, waiting. Her mother's lips parted as if she wanted to say something meaningful, something profound, but after a long pause, all she managed was, "Drive safe." Sophia gave a small, knowing smile. I always do. And with that, she stepped out into the night, leaving behind the version of herself they had once underestimated. As Sophia walked toward her car, the crisp night air filled her lungs, feeling fresher than it had in years. She had come to this dinner expecting the usual cycle: dismissal, condescension, and being overshadowed by Lucas's ego. Instead, she had left with something far greater: control over her own narrative. She no longer needed to prove anything to them. They had seen it for themselves. Clutching her bag tighter, she glanced back at the Grand Carter estate, its towering structure bathed in warm light. It was a symbol of everything her family valued: legacy, wealth, status. But tonight, it had been forced to acknowledge something new: her. Sliding into the driver's seat, Sophia let out a slow breath, her fingers tapping idly against the steering wheel. She had spent years chasing recognition from people who never cared to see her, but now, she realized, she didn't need their acceptance, only their respect. And she had earned it, not by playing their game, but by mastering her own. As she pulled onto the quiet road leading back into the city, a new thought settled in her mind: maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. With the city lights twinkling in the distance, Sophia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she wasn't leaving a family gathering feeling diminished or ignored. She had stood her ground, not just as a Carter, but as herself, a woman who had built something of value on her own terms. The thought made her smile, a rare, genuine expression that had been absent for too long. The road stretched ahead, open and full of possibilities, and for the first time, she felt completely in control of where she was going. As she drove, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from an unknown number. Curious, she unlocked the screen and read the text. Ms. Carter, I was impressed by your work on the Monteverde case. I have a property issue that might interest you. Would you be open to discussing it? Sophia let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head in disbelief. Even before her family had fully processed what had happened tonight, the outside world already had. Without hesitation, she typed back, "Let's talk." And just like that, Sophia Carter was no longer just the overlooked archivist, she was a force to be reckoned with.